Un jour d'octobre 2011, Barack Obama a fait pleurer Angela Merkel. L'incident s'est produit lors d'une réunion du G20 quand le président américain a insisté pour que la Banque centrale européenne achète des obligations du Trésor grec. Afin de comprendre pourquoi la perspective d'un assouplissement quantitatif a pu arracher des larmes à une politicienne réputée pour son impassibilité, nous avons besoin des outils de ce que Daniela Gabor appelle la théorie critique de la macrofinance. Inspirée par l'économiste post-keynésien Hyman Minsky, la macrofinance étudie les relations entre le capital et l'État au prisme du dispositif formé par les ministères des Finances, les banques centrales, les institutions financières internationales et les investisseurs privés. L'approche de Daniela Gabor est critique parce qu'elle historicise les rôles assumés par les différents acteurs et montre comment la transformation de leurs interactions résulte de luttes politiques impliquant les détenteurs d'actifs et les organismes publics, mais aussi les syndicats et les mouvements sociaux. La périodisation qui en résulte correspond à une succession de régimes macrofinanciers. Chacun d'eux se distingue par un consensus sur ce que l'on peut attendre des gouvernements, des banquiers centraux et de la finance de marché. Au cours des 3 décennies qui ont suivi la conférence de Bretton Woods, le consensus entre les pays occidentaux reposait sur le bien fondé d'un alignement des politiques fiscales et monétaires afin d'aider l'État à garantir le plein emploi et à investir dans les services publics et la couverture des risques. À la fin des années 1970, cependant, les pressions inflationnistes dues aux revendications sociales dans les pays du Nord et à la remise en cause du système d'échanges inégaux par les pays du Sud ont précipité l'avènement d'un régime connu sous le nom de consensus de Washington. Milton Friedman, dont les déclarations se sont alors imposées comme le sens commun, appelait à dissocier la politique monétaire de la politique budgétaire, quitte à infliger des chocs récessifs aux économies. Pour manifester leur indépendance, les banquiers centraux devaient faire de la stabilité des prix leur seule préoccupation. Aussi réclamait-il qu'à la suite de Margaret Thatcher, les élus fassent le serment de renoncer à toute création monétaire inconsidérée. Contraints de privatiser les entreprises publiques et de libéraliser le marché du travail, les gouvernements acquis au consensus de Washington ne s'efforçaient pas moins de convertir l'austérité en promesse. Selon eux, laisser les investisseurs privés allouer les ressources à leur guise était à terme le meilleur moyen d'améliorer le bien-être de leurs administrés. Peu contestée jusqu'au début du XXIe siècle, l'orthodoxie néolibérale a ensuite cessé de faire l'unanimité. Pour autant, les institutions financières sont demeurées trop puissantes, même après la crise de 2008, pour permettre le retour du régime de Bretton Woods. Ainsi s'explique l'apparition de ce que Daniela Gabor appelle le consensus de Wall Street. Sous ce nouveau régime, les États ont de nouveau été habilités à se fixer des objectifs ambitieux. En revanche, il leur est demeuré interdit de prendre les mesures qui leur auraient permis de financer ces projets sur leur propre denier. Au lieu d'investir pour leur compte, les responsables politiques convertis à la nouvelle donne ont donc conclu des pactes d'investissabilité dont l'objectif était d'inciter les investisseurs privés à financer la réalisation de leurs ambitions. Devenus des risqueurs, explique Daniela Gabor, l'État ne se borne plus à laisser le capital financier s'investir comme il l'entend. Désormais, il s'agit de lui donner l'envie d'aller dans la bonne direction. Aux allègements fiscaux et aux déréglementations généralisées succèdent des crédits d'impôt et des assouplissements réglementaires réservés aux investisseurs qui se disent désireux de rendre la planète plus verte et la pauvreté plus rare. L'avènement de l'état des risqueurs soulève alors 2 séries de questions. La première, qui est au cœur du travail de Daniela Gabor, concerne la différence entre les consensus de Washington et de Wall Street. Peut-on considérer que le second amorce une rupture avec la rationalité néolibérale qui informe le premier, ou doit-on plutôt admettre que des initiatives telles que l'horizon 2030 de la Banque mondiale, la loi sur la réduction de l'inflation de l'administration Biden et le pacte vert européen relèvent pour l'essentiel du greenwashing et de la privatisation déguisée des biens publics? Pour la gauche, l'enjeu est considérable. Entrer dans la logique du dérisking revient en effet à considérer que l'argent privé pourrait être mobilisé pour le bien public, à condition d'ajouter des bâtons aux carottes. Par exemple, en pénalisant les investissements sales, comme on récompense les contributions à la transition énergétique. À l'inverse, rejeter le principe même du consensus de Wall Street implique de considérer que seul un grand État vert peut nous sauver. Dans un cas, la question est de savoir si le capital peut être discipliné. Dans l'autre, si la planification peut être démocratisée. Enfin, la deuxième série d'interrogations porte sur la viabilité du consensus de Wall Street à l'ère Trump 2.0. Peut-on encore parler d'un État dérisqueur lorsque les crédits d'impôt cèdent la place à une étrange combinaison d'abattements fiscaux et de tarifs douaniers ? Et que restera-t-il de la logique néolibérale si le président Orange parvient à plier la réserve fédérale à sa volonté ? Si Daniela Gabor estime que le régime de dérisking est en train de muter plutôt que de disparaître, elle note également que les consensus macrofinanciers sont généralement sur le point de s'effondrer lorsque les dirigeants des puissances dominantes commencent à se plaindre d'être exploités par des alliés ingrats. Ce fut le cas de Richard Nixon lorsqu'il a décidé de suspendre la convertibilité du dollar en or, mais aussi des dirigeants soviétiques juste avant la perestroïka. Le retour de l'hégémon géniard pourrait-il annoncer la fin du consensus de Wall Street ? Notre entretien a eu lieu à Paris le 11 avril 2025.
Let me start by asking you about critical macrofinance, which you define as both the political and historical exploration of the relationship between finance and the state at the macro level. So, basic questions: what are the key tenets and the major actors involved in macrofinance? And also, what does critical entail in terms of questioning and historicizing received ideas of what constitute a consensus?
Okay, so critical macrofinance is, I would say, a relatively new kind of theoretical framework for understanding contemporary capitalism. It is new in the sense that it's gotten this name recently through a body of work of my work and several other colleagues. But its main insights and instincts go back to as far as Hyman Minsky and even before him. And basically, the idea is that in order to understand macroeconomic policy, so we start from the macroeconomic institutions of the state, you need to think very carefully and to trace structural changes in the financial system. So macrofinance, in the critical macrofinance, is this Minskyan understanding of the dynamic interaction between the institutions of the state, the macro institutions of the state, the central bank, the treasury, and we will see also the institutions of the welfare state and the transformations of the welfare state, and the financial system that could be bank-based, as in most of your credit is created and most of the money is created through traditional relationship banks, or more market-based finance, where you have a much broader ecosystem of financial institutions which are doing some kind of credit creation through capital markets or alongside banks who create credit through traditional means. So that's the macrofinance. It goes back to Hyman Minsky. The critical in there comes from my particular understanding, or wanting to understand how this organic evolution of the state and finance happens, this relationship. It's fundamentally, it's a theory about the relationship between the state and capital, in particular financial capital, but not exclusively. And this relationship doesn't evolve in some kind of, linear way. There is a lot of political struggle around it. And this political struggle sometimes leans on changes or generates changes in the institutions of the state. Sometimes it generates changes in the institutions of finance. That's the kind of basic explanation of the critical. A broader understanding, as you alluded to, looks at historical trajectories and broader political changes over decades or over regimes, if you want. And we can talk about neoliberalism, about post-neoliberalism, about the post-Second World War Keynesian consensus of some sorts. And why do I think it's important to have critical macrofinance? Well, as an analytical lens, when I started my doctoral research was on the role that the Central Bank of Romania played in the transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-based economy. And what I understood from studying that period from 1990 to roughly 2009, what I understood is that a lot of studies of neoliberalism don't pay much attention to the central bank in particular. The central bank is in some ways, neoliberalism achieved a great, I would say, ideological coup, if you want, because it portrays central banks as institutions who are technocratic, who are in charge of price stability, and we shouldn't think about them. And therefore, our political economy analysis rarely thinks of central banks as very important political actors. And I would say most analysis of neoliberalism ignore the central bank. And what critical macrofinance does is to say, well, we have, when we think about state institutions, we shouldn't only think about elected politicians and the choices that they make under particular constraints, but we should think about the ways in which those choices are produced through political struggles in the relationship with the central bank. Particularly because neoliberalism has also been for a very long time associated with a period of financialization, with a period of the increasing structural and infrastructural power of the financial system. And you can't understand that process of financialization without understanding the role of, or thinking conceptually about the role of the central bank. So that's, I would say, that's the three very important sets of actors that we have: is the state, the treasury, that is the political fiscal arm of the state that does decisions, that takes decisions about spending on welfare or on industrial policy. More recently, that makes decisions about taxation. And then you have the central bank, whose relationship with financial capital has become closer and closer over the last 2 decades, I would say in particular. In a way, as a form, and maybe we'll talk about it more, as a form of resolving particular political problems and institutional problems that neoliberalism poses for the state and for its macroeconomic policymaking abilities.
And then there's the private financial actors too.
Yes.
Regardless of which system we are, they have a role, a different one in each one. But that's also one of the key actors.
Exactly. So besides the institutions of the state, then critical macrofinance looks at the ways in which private finance organizes itself as an ecosystem, the different kinds of actors and the different drivers in that political or in that ecosystem. I would say shadow banking is an interesting example of the necessity to think about the organic changes in financial structure over the last.
Can you tell us more about, for people who wouldn't know, what shadow banking is?
Okay, shadow banking is a term that popped up in political discourse with the global financial crisis in 2008. I remember that there was in 2000, after the global financial crisis reached its most intense with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008 in the US, and then it kind of spread everywhere around the world. In 2009, the US politicians decided to have a financial inquiry commission, and that financial inquiry commission needed to find a villain for the global crisis, and the villain that they came up with was called shadow banking, and that's how we started thinking about shadow banking, because all of a sudden he was the villain that kind of brought down nearly the global financial system and the global economy with it. And there are many different ways in which one can think about shadow banking. We first thought about shadow banking as a process of securitization, where you take, and it became famous globally with the collapse of the subprime mortgage market in the US in 2007, when we discovered that securitization, which is you take, for example, mortgage loans created by banks, you take them, you put them in a special purpose vehicle, and you issue debt securities, bonds that you can trade, that have different ratings, and you can sell them to different financial institutions with different kinds of risk appetites. This process of securitization was supposed to diversify risk. This is how it was sold in the United States. Then we discovered that it basically concentrated risk. So that's one way in which we thought about securitization, about shadow banking first, that it was this kind of obscure process of producing liquid or seemingly liquid assets out of illiquid loans. Then the definition became broader and broader, because once you started to work out why Bear Stearns, for example, collapsed in 2006, or why Lehman Brothers collapsed, then the world looked at shadow banking as a process of creating credit through capital markets and financing them through a market that is very dear to me, that is very technical, the repo market, where you can take your bonds and finance them by borrowing against them as collateral. So shadow banking is a process of credit creation and intermediation and financing of those credit activities in new markets and through new instruments, sometimes involving directly the regulated banking system, sometimes not. Another way to think about it, and I would suggest Zoltán Pozsár, Hungarian economist, became very famous by producing what he called a map of shadow banking in 2010 with several other colleagues, but he kind of stayed in our consciousness as the guy who produced the shadow banking map. And if you look at it, it looks like a circuit of this little a board where you have all these different types of institutions connected to each other. It looks very complex, that map. And a way to simplify it is to say, well, in a financial system where you have growing what we call institutional cash pools, that is, financial institutions that are amassing large cash that cannot be covered by a standard deposit guarantee, which in the US used to be $100,000 and now is $250,000. If these institutions want to hold that cash, they can't hold it in a bank deposit, because this bank deposit is basically unsecured exposure after the upper limit of the deposit guarantee. So what shadow banking does is it creates financial instruments which meet this demand for safety. And how does it do that? Well, it brings this demand for safety together with demand for leverage from leverage-hungry financial institutions like hedge funds or other kinds of bond funds. So another way of thinking about shadow banking is to say there is a growing set of cash-rich institutions who are entering trading relationships with cash poor but leverage hungry financial institutions, and shadow banking produces the instruments, the money-like instruments through which these two sets of institutions can basically coexist and meet each other's needs. It's a term that kind of went out of fashion in 2015, and it went out of fashion because to my mind, and that's where critical macrofinance is a useful way to think about it, because the reform of the shadow banking system that was a political priority after the global financial crisis kind of started to lose steam after 2010 to 2011, once policymakers realized that the state and its macroeconomic institutions were at the core of the shadow banking system. That for the decades of what we call neoliberalism, they had together, the state had kind of entered a shadow banking pact with shadow banking institutions. They together created what I call an investibility pact or a liquidity pact for government bonds, a pact for the functioning of central banks under inflation targeting regimes and under independence. And in order to reform shadow banking, you had to reform the state. And it's very difficult to reform the state, although now it seems to be at least a political horizon that it's easier to contemplate. But after 2008, the idea that you have to reform the institutions of the state, the way in which the central bank works, the way in which the treasury works, the relationship between them, that didn't come across as a political possibility, and therefore we dropped the reform of shadow banking in order to not have to reform more broadly the neoliberal institutional pillars of the state.
So before we go into the history of what you can see through critical macrofinance, a last concept that it would be good to pause with is the concept of consensus. which seems to be like, you go from one consensus to the other. So what would constitute a consensus in terms of the relationship between these actors that you've defined?
Very good. So this is another layer of the work that I've been doing under the critical macrofinance umbrella, which is to try to identify the origins of or the political and ideological regime under which state-capital relations have changed over the last 4 to 5 decades after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the emergence of what we call neoliberalism. And many have described the period of neoliberalism that starts in the late 1970s, early 1980s, as the Washington Consensus. And it is a consensus in the sense that it reflects it's not a consensus in that everybody subscribes to it, but it's a consensus in the sense that it reflects a kind of political understanding in Washington or in wherever the seat of the hegemon would be. But this is a story about American financial capital to a great extent. It's a consensus about what it would take in order for countries to be well integrated into the global economic order that the US was creating when it was re-engineering after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. So the Washington Consensus was a consensus about what we call a trinity of macroeconomic and other kinds of economic policy measures that would put the market as they would create the space for the market to work as an allocation engine, and that would shrink what we would call a big government approach or a Keynesian approach against which neoliberalism fought. So it was a consensus that you needed to privatize. The three key words were privatization, liberalization, and stabilization. That is, you have to privatize not just state-owned companies, but to basically roll back the welfare state as well. You had to liberalize labor markets, prices, capital accounts, allowing capital to flow very freely. It wasn't a consensus about the free flow of labor or humans across borders, but it was certainly a consensus that capital should not face any kinds of impediments in moving freely within and across countries. So you basically removed what we call measures of financial repression, which is the state trying to repress finance within its territory. And the consensus said you also had to remove international or cross-border obstacles to the free movement of capital. And it was a consensus that it was sometimes imposed through what we call the Washington Consensus institutions or the IMF and the World Bank, which subscribed to this consensus, and they were, in a sense, they were promoting the US Treasury view of international economic policy in countries in the global south. And they were promoting them sometimes through, I would say, sheer economic force, as in they were forcing countries to adopt or to pursue this holy trinity of the Washington Consensus, even where domestically there wasn't enough sort of political purchase, because we know, and the Washington Consensus became discredited because it basically created very significant social and economic costs where it was adopted and where it was pushed in countries in the global south. And this consensus, I argue then by the late 1990s, it starts to lose at least political purchase and credibility in countries in the global south and in left movements in the global north. I mean, the left movements always kind of questioned it, but they didn't focus so much on the parts of, stabilization, on the role of the central bank in that story. So it starts to lose credibility because its emphasis on the market or on the free market, it clearly doesn't work very well. Not many countries who pursue the Washington Consensus actually manage to create some kind of dynamic capitalist economy. And then you have some kind of apologies that say, okay, well, the problem is that we forgot that sometimes markets are imperfect, so we'll create a post-Washington Consensus. We'll accommodate.
We're going to get there at length.
Yes. We'll accommodate some kinds of externalities, but the logic is always that the basic tenets are the same.
Before we get to transition from the Washington consensus to what you call the Wall Street consensus, which is the one that will be the second neoliberal consensus that will appear and that is still at work and at play right now. Just quickly, maybe, let's go back to the beginning of the Washington consensus and what role did the collapse of other consensuses played in the emergence of the Washington consensus. I'm thinking about the Bretton Woods system and maybe consensus, but which sort of created a post-war compact, but also the one that was never implemented, but that was at least presented as a possibility, which was the new international economic order proposed by mostly the non-aligned countries of the global south, but also something that you've known in your early days, the state socialism, Eastern state socialism bloc. So how do we articulate the beginning of the Washington consensus with the collapse of at least two of these regimes and the never emergence of the third one, which would be the NIEO?
All right. So I would, in many ways, the most well-known account is the collapse of the post-Keynesian economic order on the back of the kind of contradictions of the capitalist accumulation regimes in countries in the global north, particularly, but not exclusively, the United States. And an important moment there is if you want, the disintegration of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates that put the US dollar at the center of the international monetary order and tied the US dollar to gold, while avoiding to a certain extent some of the restrictions and kind of contractionary nature of a full gold standard. That moment in 1971, in August 1971, when President Nixon makes a speech, it's a fascinating moment if we kind of think about it, and perhaps we'll go back to it in relationship to where Trump, the second Trump administration is now, which is then as now there was a sense in the American political elite that its position as a hegemon was not benefiting the US, but it was a cost to the US. It was its allies were taking advantage of it. Its enemies were growing in strength. And if you listen to that speech, Nixon says, well, we have three priorities in this before the new international economic order. Nixon came up with the new economic policy plan. He called it like that. And he said, we have three priorities there. The first priority is jobs, trying to increase American jobs, which sounds kind of familiar. The second priority was the cost of living, which was, again, it sounds quite similar to what we have now. And the third one was, he called it the role of the dollar and protecting the American dollar against international, he called them international money speculators. And that to me is the beginning or marks the beginning of the growing hegemony of financial capital that will solidify during the 1980s and 1990s with neoliberalism, and will kind of become very visible with what I call the Wall Street consensus. And what Nixon meant by international money speculators was he imagined some sort of financial speculators in the Eurodollar market in London that were constantly trying to get or to speculate that the US will either have to drop or to change the rate at which the US dollar was trading to gold, or it would try to change the exchange rate at which surplus countries like Germany, their currencies were trading against the dollar. And this constant speculation that kind of ended up by the late 1960s as being described as a crisis of the dollar. This constant speculation, Nixon attributed to some, bizarre, unknown, like faceless list of international money speculators years. When you read the Bank of England's 1971 papers on the euro-dollar market, you see they were American banks in London. The American banks in London were creating the, offshore dollars in London. They were rerouting some of those offshore dollars for payment reasons to the US and back, and they were the ones who were constantly speculating. And it wasn't just them, obviously there were London banks, there were other banks, but most of the euro-dollar transactions, that was an interbank market, most of it was American banks basically making money and pursuing not the objectives of the American hegemon, but they were pursuing profit making. So to me, that is an interesting moment, 1971, because it kind of signals the breakdown of what let's call it a kind of Keynesian / Bretton Woods consensus, which we, at least I, who am not an expert in that period, that's a historical period that is, I always imagined it as somehow being a bit calmer than, the 1980s and 1990s, because that's where you see a lot more financial crisis. But even that period was a period of very significant tensions between the US and its allies, and the US and the Soviet Union, that play out in the international money arena and that also play out domestically. And the end, when that consensus breaks down with Nixon saying, okay, you know what, we can't defend this system anymore. I'm going to prioritize my domestic economy. I'm going to use my interest rates in order to try to stimulate the economy. I'm going to use my fiscal policy to try to stimulate the economy to achieve higher jobs, or to try to redress the trade deficits. The US was then as concerned about trade deficits and blaming others for trade deficits as it is now. That period kind of opens up the question of was the Keynesian consensus in high-income countries or in rich countries in the global north, was it really a Keynesian consensus in the sense that did it organize the state-capital relationships in a way that basically put the state in the driving seat and that benefited distributionally labor rather than capital? And the standard answer is always yes. This is the era of big government. Even Nixon, when he talks about the end of the Bretton, when he breaks down the parity of the dollar to gold, talks about full employment, and he's not a Keynesian Democrat who dreams of full employment, but that's the language is there. But if you read Hyman Minsky again, he says, you know what, that period actually was a period when the state was subsidizing capital profits. It wasn't. We shouldn't think of it as the glory period of the distributional struggle where labor always won. And to me, so that part of the consensus became a very important political terrain for struggle as to what comes next, and basically particularly with the Volcker shock after the period of high inflation linked to the increase in the price of oil. And the impossibility or the unwillingness of political elites to put in place a system where you'd have significant planning of the economy and significant state ownership of the economy in countries in the global north, you go into the Volcker shock, and that's when from 1979 to 1982, it's a shock where basically Milton Friedman's view of the world and view of the economy gets a broad audience and gets power to listen. So I'm not sure that this is there is an easy answer to why that consensus broke down there, and why it went into neoliberalism and into the idea that all you need to do in order to resolve the accumulation and inflation problems of the Keynesian era is to reduce drastically the power of organized labor, to put central banks in charge of macroeconomic stability, and to shrink the role of the government. That's the political consensus that emerges from those 1970s. Why a parallel system didn't emerge? I'm not a historian, so I can't account for that particular bit of the story. I am clearer that the new international economic order of countries in the global south, who in 1974, while everything, while the US and the global north is undergoing this kind of a period of very profound instability where the logic of the international economic order is being questioned. Countries in the global south, with support from UNCTAD and with support from the dependency school, they articulate a vision of an international world economy where there is more equality, where the post-colonial world somehow manages to become equals to countries in the global north, where patterns of unequal exchange are reversed, where you get technology transfers, where you get industrialization in a way that deals with what Raoul Prebisch described, deteriorating terms of trade for commodity producers in the global south. All these were going to get in this new international economic order. All these were going to be resolved by essentially a more benign global north, which accepts responsibility for the colonial period, which accepts responsibility for reordering the international economic system, which transfers technologies, which accepts industrialization, accepts to lose market share for their industries. And that is probably the shortest lived consensus we have had in some ways, because by the late 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, nobody takes it seriously in the global north. For a while, some more progressive politicians from Germany, for example, they kind of engage with countries in the global south, but mostly the US administrations didn't. And I think that bit died quite easily also because countries in the global south did not have sufficient coherence or it wasn't a sufficiently coherent group, either ideologically or in terms of or institutionally, to put sufficient political momentum behind this new international economic order. So it was a nice dream. This dream reappears every now and then, although with some kind of less broad geographical scope than it had at the moment. So I would say that was a shorter-lived dream. It died because in many ways it imagined a world of benign relationships between countries that would willingly give up economic and political privilege in the name of some kind of more horizontal relationships. And the third bit that you described, the collapse of state socialism, that is the saddest part in some ways, because I lived through some of it. Fritz Bartel wrote a really interesting book called The Triumph of Broken Promises that charts the ways in which both capitalist countries in the West and socialist countries and their governments found it increasingly difficult to meet or the terms of the social contract that they had been striking with their citizens. And for countries in the Soviet Union sphere of influence, the difficulty came from the fact that the Soviet Union, our hegemon at the time, had a kind of whiny hegemon problem that the US seems to have repeatedly, in which they said, why are we financing your economies, your welfare state, your citizens with cheap oil when our citizens are poorer or our citizens don't get the benefits of this commodity? And after 1973, it was clear that this commodity was increasing in price, so the distributional politics became a lot more visible. So countries in the Soviet sphere of influence, it became, in many ways, found it increasingly difficult to sustain their planning and particularly their social provision for the citizens, which wasn't like extremely generous. But I can remember in the early 1980s, well, I can't remember, but my parents tell me, or in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we would get free healthcare, free transport or very, very cheap transport, free education, free holidays in the summer, and a lot of different items of food provided directly by the state. So it was a certain burden, and this burden that required imports of oil or imports of various commodities, was in many ways accelerated, I would say, by the failure of the plan. In many different countries, the socialist planning didn't work very well. There are big controversies about the extent to which the plan by itself is an inefficient allocation mechanism, or we had inefficient bureaucrats or technocrats, or external conditions made everything a lot worse. I would say there is a bit of a grain of truth to each one of them. But by the late 1980s, it was clear that, especially after Poland goes to gets indebted in international markets, like Romania did, gets an IMF loan, then he has to undergo an IMF structural adjustment. The Washington Consensus starts to kind of come east, and that destabilizes further that regime. And once you have the collapse of the Eastern Bloc in 1989, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1992, the Washington Consensus comes to Eastern Europe, and it becomes what we know there as shock therapy, and that is in many ways that is one of the most, I would say, most extreme manifestations of a consensus that is pushed onto countries. Even when the limits or the political and social costs of that consensus become so obvious that even pro-market or free market ideologues are resisting it.
It's just a detail, but maybe it's a nice signal to, future critical macro finance theorists, is the fact that it seems like if we say that we go from one consensus to another, that usually the sign that a consensus is about to crumble and a new one is about to emerge is when a hegemon starts to whine, right? So you have it with Nixon in 71, you have it with Soviet Union at the end of the 70s. Why do we pay for all these people who don't deserve it? Always that. We have it today, so maybe that could be some kind of a canary sign too. But it seems like the whining hegemon seems to be a precursor of a change of consensus. Okay.
Very good. I think you're right in the sense that all consensuses need some kind of hegemon to push it within and outside borders. And once the hegemon doesn't see the benefits of the benefits of pushing that consensus, both ideationally and the ideational and material benefits that are no longer materializing, or there is some contender that fares better within that consensus, then the contours of that consensus will change one way or another.
That's right. But with always the discourse that they are taking advantage of us. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's go back to. We went to the beginning of the Washington Consensus. Let's go to the end, because your main current work now is on the consensus that followed the Washington Consensus, which you call the Wall Street Consensus. So, considering that you both see them as being part of the general, I would say, neoliberal epistemological outlook and with its political consequences, what do you see as the continuities, the shifts in the premise, in the expectation, and the tools that are distinctive of the two consensus? So that we did the first part of the question. And the second part of the question is, what are the events that you would say would precipitate the change from one to another? I mean, we can think, of course, of the subprime banking crisis of 2008, you mentioned that, but also maybe the Eurozone crisis of 2011-12, the emergence of the Paris Agreement in 2016, the COVID pandemic, and so forth. So both structurally, how did they differ and how do they resemble each other? And historically, how do we get from one to the other?
Very good. So the Wall Street Consensus is, just to define it very quickly, is a substantive shift in state-capital relations from the age of the Washington Consensus, in which the state assumes overtly a more transformative role, as in the state has to asks questions about what needs to be transformed in the economy in order for us to weather a crisis, whether it's a climate crisis, whether it's a geopolitical crisis, whether it's a competitiveness crisis. So the state, unlike the Washington Consensus, accepts that it has to play a more explicit role, but it is hindered in answering that question of, or it has to ask the question, how do we pay for transformation? I think that's a very important question that comes over and over again in whatever kind of state project that envisages a bigger role for the state. And when it asks how to pay for transformation, then the answer in the Wall Street Consensus is private finance. The answer is private finance. If you think about Keynes's kind of reflection that anything we can do, we can pay for, which was his argument that we can arrange the institutions of the state, the macro institutions of the state, in a way that allows us to pay for transformation. In the Wall Street Consensus, this Keynesian premise becomes anything we can do, private finance will pay for. And you could see it in many different ways, in many different contexts. The first time I observed it as a consensus, and I will talk a bit more about what I think is a fundamental discontinuity or difference, which is the kind of state project that each consensus has at its core, or the political imaginary and the role that it assigns to the state is fundamentally different. But the first time I noticed it as a consensus is in 2015, not with climate, but with the Sustainable Development Goals in international development, where for the first time the World Bank says very clearly, and not just the World Bank, but the United Nations Conference on financing for development that takes place every 10 years. In 2015, the private finance becomes a critical ally or partner in delivering the Sustainable Development Goals, in delivering financing for development. So that's the first time that this consensus is articulated publicly, where there is the rhetoric of a partnership becomes very important. So now we are making, the Wall Street Consensus makes it explicit that in order to achieve any kind of significant transformation, you need the state to partner with private capital, because the state has transformative ambitions, but it doesn't have the money because of fiscal restrictions. Private capital has the money, and here the trillions of shadow banks or asset managers, those trillions become a very important kind of part of the narrative of transformation. Those trillions by themselves will not go into the places where the state would like them to go. So there is a kind of institutional not failure, but an institutional lack within the state, that it cannot generate public fiscal resources. That's the narrative of the Wall Street Consensus, that the state cannot generate significant fiscal resources, and the private sector cannot generate sufficient returns for the transformative ambitions of the state. So the logic of the partnership is there is a redistribution of risks from the private sector to the state, in which the state basically makes it more attractive for private capital to invest in the priorities that the state has identified, like development, then it becomes climate, then it becomes industrial policy, then it becomes armament. All of these new areas of that the state, new transformative ambitions that the state accumulates as, the global economy changes. The Wall Street Consensus says private finance can deliver if there are partnerships, investability partnerships or bankability partnerships with the state. And I would say, I don't usually call it a neoliberal project, the Wall Street Consensus, because because of the way in which it reimagines the role of the state as an important economic and political actor. If you will remember, the Washington Consensus at its core, although in practice it was very different, but at its core, in its ideology, it was an anti-state project. It assumed, you can think about the way in which the Republicans and Ronald Reagan, and then Ronald Reagan and then the Republicans during the Clinton era always accused the Democrats of wanting big government. The Washington Consensus had a specific obsession with big government, and rolling back big government in its many manifestations was critical, right, to achieving a market-led order. I would say that's how they described. Whereas in the Wall Street Consensus, the state comes back, and it comes back as a legitimate economic actor, but not in the old Keynesian sense. It is a state that is all guided by the question, how do I make nature or education or infrastructure, housing, health, how do I make them investable for private capital? This is the role of the state, and I call this project the de-risking state, which has more ambitions, which is allowed now is to re-enter economic life, but on very specific terms and in a very specific relationship with private capital. So it's not neoliberal in that sense, but where it preserves the fundamental pillars of neoliberalism, and that's where I think again critical macrofinance is useful, because it forces us to look at the neoliberal pillars put in place by macroeconomic pillars put in place by neoliberalism, which is an independent central bank targeting inflation and a treasury conducting fiscal policy, always either under the discipline of the central bank or under the discipline of the bond vigilantes, of the investors who buy and sell government bonds with a view of the long-term fiscal health of the spending plans or the taxation plans of the government. So the Wall Street Consensus brings back the state, but it doesn't fundamentally transform the macroeconomic institutions of the state from the neoliberal era, and in many ways it accelerates some of the dynamics of the neoliberal state, particularly the social contract around welfare provision and pensions with the state.
So two concept needs, two are key in the functioning of the Wall Street Consensus. One is the notion that you mentioned quickly, but I'd like you to come back to it, which is the notion of de-risking, which is not only at the center of your work, but at the center of what your work describes. And also this other really important thing, which is the production of investable project, right? So we already understand from what you described where they fit in this Wall Street Consensus, but when do they appear as concept, first of all? Because if you think, for instance, of the Eurozone crisis of 2011-2012, there you still have this notion that, austerity has to be justified in kind of an old neoliberal way. So it's not about so much the return of the state. So even though probably the Wall Street Consensus de facto, well, first of all, that's my question. When do you think it actually starts without being recognized as such? And when does it start being fully recognized as such, with then the concept of de-risking and the concepts of investable projects being used?
Very good. I would say that investability has been a kind of neoliberal, in a sense, an obsession and a priority and a problem of the neoliberal state since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the ideological victory of monetarism. So I would say, if I was to kind of historicize the Wall Street Consensus, there are pillars or dynamics of the consensus that start as early as the 1980s, and I like to think of them as a kind of, there is let's call it a social bargain with financiers that starts in the 1980s, and the macro bargain with financiers that also starts in the 1980s. And that second bargain is a bargain around or a pact around investibility of government bonds. So in a sense, it is kind of investibility. It starts as a state project in some ways, as a project of making government bonds investable, and then it gets extended to other areas of economic life later after the global financial crisis. And let me try to elaborate a bit. What do I mean by this investibility pact? And here, in many ways, if you can read monetarism in many different ways, right? Milton Friedman, so for example, when Milton Friedman explains inflation, right, which was the big economic question to resolve in the late 1970s, he gives a speech in 1978 and he says, it is customary for us to blame the oil sheikhs or the trade unions or corporations for inflation. But oil sheikhs don't produce inflation, corporations don't produce inflation, trade unions don't produce inflation. What produces inflation is Washington. Inflation is produced in Washington by the government, who gets access to the printing press and creates money, and this money, this excessive money creation, it basically generates inflation. So this is an account to me of inflation as a political problem and as a money creation problem that requires institutionally a divorce between monetary and fiscal policy, right? If you can think about it, there was a Keynesian marriage between the two, in which the central bank, and this goes even before Keynesianism, the central bank was a fiscal agent of the state, and it had overt or implicit responsibilities for preserving or defending borrowing costs or keeping borrowing costs low for the state throughout. It always does throughout wars. Throughout the Keynesian period, there was a kind of fiscal subordination, as in monetary policy was subordinated to fiscal policy priorities. And Milton Friedman says we need this divorce to happen if we are to control inflation. We need, and Margaret Thatcher was famously photographed with her hand on the printing press saying, that's it, that's the end. We will no longer, populist governments will no longer print money in order to satisfy, a certain sectional political interests. From now on, you will have technocratic central banks basically in control of inflation by making sure that they impose a certain money growth rule. And then a lot of debate around monetarism focused on, was it the right money supply definition? Was it the right policy? Is it interest rates or quantities of money that matter? And to me, a critical macrofinance account says, forget about that. I mean, that's important. The way in which you design the monetary policy framework is important. But if we want to tell a story about a broader kind of consensus emerging out of neoliberalism, out of the Washington consensus and morphing into the Wall Street consensus, you have to think about the ways in which this divorce between monetary and fiscal policy creates problems for both the monetary authority and for the fiscal authority. And that problem essentially is, what do you do when the central bank no longer wants to have responsibility either as your fiscal agent, so you as a treasury don't have an account at the central bank, or when the central bank doesn't want to use government bonds to implement monetary policy. It wants to stay away from the government bond market as much as possible. And in those two scenarios, and I mean, there are some technicalities of the differences between those two scenarios, but in those two scenarios, the end result is that the government has to think, who's going to buy my bonds? If I issue bonds, either because I need to reduce the amount of central bank money in existence, or because I am banking with a commercial bank, and in order to spend, I need to get money added into that commercial bank. Once governments have to face this problem, the question of investibility becomes fundamental, because you have to then now compete with other governments to attract investors. And how do you generate liquidity for your government bond market becomes very important. And here where the pact with financiers matters, because in the 1980s and 1990s, we see governments everywhere giving the financiers in the what we call the repo market, in the market where you can finance government bonds by using them as collateral, it gives financiers free rein to design a set of rules and a set of practices that would create additional liquidity in that market. And even after, when the problems with that market become apparent after 1998, after the collapse of long-term capital management, the LTCM, the hedge fund was taking leverage positions on government bonds, both central banks and fiscal authorities or ministries of finance recognize that there is a problem in this liquidity pact with financiers, because the more you allow leverage-hungry or profit-hungry financial institutions like hedge funds, the more you allow them to use government bonds as collateral in order to increase the amount of leverage they can get in the system, the more vulnerability and financial instability you inject in the financial system. So there is a recognition that there is a systemic vulnerability there, but for governments, the investibility priority remains the key one, and they take measures in order to make it easier for financiers to use government bonds as collateral. Paul Volcker very famously in 1984, I think, changes the legal provisions around collateral in repo markets to make sure that if you lend again in a repo transaction against government bonds, and the borrower, the financial institution to which you lend, becomes insolvent, you can keep that collateral and liquidate it, which you could do in the European Union, the European countries at the time, because the legal provisions were different. But in the US, you couldn't. So we see governments taking increasingly these are technical legal steps to make government bonds more investable by basically saying to financiers, please use them for leverage, please use them for speculation. We hoped that because we are a safe asset, because in crisis you have to run to government bonds, nothing will go wrong. So this, and you can see the story, I told you some details about it in the United States. You can see the same story in countries as diverse as Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, where there are various levels of suspicion around the instability properties of this liquidity pact. But because this global competition for bond investors becomes fiercer and fiercer, basically governments everywhere kind of give into it. So investability has been there for a very long time. Central banks also contributed to it. It wasn't only governments. They had a kind of separate pact with repo financiers. Salomon Brothers is a very good example of a repo financier that was basically cuddled by both the central bank, by the Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Treasury after it cornered, or it kind of speculated with U.S. Treasuries in 1991. In a very blatant speculative attack on U.S. Treasuries, and it got away with a slap on the wrist, and it got the U.S. government to change the rules governing the U.S. Treasury market to make it easier for future speculators in some way to kind of speculate in there. There wasn't a massive, and I think that's a fascinating episode, because there wasn't a massive reorganization of the financial system. It was just incremental changes to make it easier for financiers to use collateral in the way that Salomon Brothers did. So for central banks, the problem was different, and the European Central Bank is a great example, and I'm going to use it because you mentioned the European sovereign debt crisis. And to me, the European sovereign debt crisis is a crisis of investability that is created, or whose roots are very much this investability pact that the European Central Bank did with repo financiers in the euro area during the 1990s and early 2000s. And the problem there for the ECB, like other central banks, is that they didn't want to use government bonds a lot to buy and sell. This is how you used to do interest rate policy. You would buy outright and you would sell outright government bonds. The problem of buying government bonds outright for a monetarist, independent central bank is that it looks like you're monetizing government debt. So they said, instead of doing that, we will use repos. We will use the same instrument that the governments are using in order to try to generate additional liquidity in their government bond markets and hopefully reduce the interest rates on which they pay on their debt. We will use repos because this way, by giving banks loans over 2 weeks through a repo contract, we are not the legal owners of government bonds for more than those 2 weeks. It's a temporary change of ownership, but it's not monetary financing because the economic owner of those government bonds in a repo transaction remains the bank who is using them as collateral. It's a very clever instrument, and financiers are very clever, and you have to understand the technicalities to kind of go to the political economy aspects. And the European Central Bank did its best to try to use its collateral framework to achieve to resolve some of the political problems that a monetary union without a fiscal union had. And I think this is where the critical macrofinance is important analytically, because it asks us to understand, to think about the evolving relationship between the macroeconomic policy institutions and finance as solving particular problems of the state, not just resolve or kind of subordinating the state to the profit imperatives of the financial system. And in this case, the turn to repo markets and the turn to, or the encouragement of more market-based finance in Europe was the ECB's response to the political problem of how do I implement monetary policy for countries as diverse as Greece and Germany. And they said, and the ECB said, well, if everybody in finance treated Greek government bonds and German government bonds as the same collateral, then it's easier for me to do monetary policy. And to encourage them to treat the Greek government bonds and Greek government bonds as equal collateral, as the same country, basically. That was the intuition. They create a kind of synthetic fiscal union because the politics wasn't there for a real one. The ECB treated Greek government bonds and German government bonds as equal collateral in its collateral portfolio. So if you were an Irish bank, you could go to the ECB and say, okay, if I give you Greek bonds or Greek sovereign bonds, or if I give you German government bonds, is the same. I will get the same. The terms of the borrowing would be the same regardless of collateral. And the ECB thought this was a very clever solution. Nobody noticed it because look how long it took me to explain this to you. And in general, there were a couple of Dutch economists who complained about it, and Jean-Claude Trichet in 2005 had to go to the European Parliament and say, well, we are not, because of course the charge against this is like kind of de facto subsidies for the weaker rated sovereigns. And Jean-Claude Trichet said, well, we are not subsidizing Greece, we are not giving special favors to Greece and other lower rated sovereigns, because we use in our framework, we have adopted the practices of investability that private finance has. We mark this collateral to market and we make margin calls. And this turned out to be very, very damaging during the European sovereign debt crisis, because the ECB's collateral framework was basically amplifying what we call procyclical pressures. It was amplifying a liquidity run or a run on Greek collateral when it had to do the opposite, right? And we see there the consequences of an investability pact. And we also see with that, once you enter an investability pact with financiers, in which your ability to meet political commitments to your voters relies to a certain extent on that investability pact holding throughout good times and bad times, right? Because if it doesn't hold throughout bad times and you see your government bond borrowing costs increasing, you're going to completely, or any kind of political project will very quickly collapse under these conditions. And you can think about, today is the 11th of April. Yes, 2 days ago we saw how easily bond markets intimidate politicians. They intimidated the Trump administration, and we didn't, some didn't expect. I thought it's kind of easy to intimidate it with that. And what we saw in 2011, 2012 is the Investability Pact reaching its logical conclusion, which is the deeper the entanglement between the state and private finance in the government bond market, the more the more it requires the state to accommodate and to support investability throughout good and bad times. And that's where the term de-risking and the practice of de-risking became normalized even before 2015. It became normalized in government bond markets when central banks said, okay, I'm just going to go and buy government bonds during bad times when nobody wants to buy them. I will buy them and preserve their investability. So this is how critical macrofinance thinks very differently about quantitative easing. It thinks very differently about the purchase of government bonds by central banks during periods of market tension in 2008, 2009, then during the COVID pandemic. These are not interventions designed to support governments. These are interventions designed to uphold the Investability Pact that historically was developed as a response to or as a solution to the specific institutional problems that the neoliberal divorce between monetary and fiscal policy created. And incidentally, it was very fascinating to me 2 days ago when Trump explained why he had decided to basically pause the very substantive tariffs on all countries except China. He said, oh, well, I saw that people were a bit nervous and the bond market was not doing very well. And I thought, okay, I will have to try to find a different kind of solution. He never brought the Federal Reserve in the picture, which I'm expecting it will happen at some point quite soon. But the story of de-risking as a regime for central banks, which I tell in my research and which you can see historically emerging, is of central banks increasingly assuming a de-risking role for government bonds. That's in a sense where de-risking starts on a significant scale. And then it becomes a discourse. I didn't call it so. If you read my early research on quantitative easing or on what we call a market maker of last resort for government bonds, a role that central banks assume, I didn't call it de-risking because, I mean, it didn't occur to me, to be honest, it didn't occur to me that it was de-risking. I just thought, well, this is a way to basically pretend that we are divorced, but we still are tied together. The monetary and fiscal policy are tied together. The monetary and fiscal institutions are tied together, and the central bank just has to somehow, support that continuing divorced relationship in a different way because finance has changed so massively. But then by 2015, de-risking acquires a life of its own as a term, as a concept, as a political imaginary, when the IMF and the World Bank launch what they call the billion to trillion agenda, which is the idea that we can get trillions of financing for development if we de-risk. When the president of the World Bank in 2017 then launches the Maximizing Finance for Development agenda, and he says, in order to get more money into poor countries, into global south countries, which require a lot more investment in infrastructure in particular, we have to think about, we have to de-risk projects, we have to de-risk sectors, and we have to de-risk countries. So the discourse of de-risking becomes a part of what I call the Wall Street consensus overtly, and it moves from the domain of monetary policy, where it was implemented as a logic of preserving the state-capital relationships that were built during neoliberalism. It moves from there into other domains where elected politicians are starting to deploy it as a way of leaving neoliberalism behind, but without changing the fiscal monetary architecture.
Right, but you can tell that story in two different ways. The way you told it sort of emphasizes the continuity, how these investability pacts were there from the beginning and were finally assumed as such. you can also tell it in a flip side way, which would go to the fact that you didn't call it de-risking in your early work in 2011, is that in the beginning, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, these investability pacts were very much premised on the Washington Consensus idea that you just need the markets to do its job, and that will be for the better. And so therefore, the government is just there, the government meaning the central bank, the repo markets, and so forth, are just there to make sure that private finance invests, right? Then, with the accumulation of crises comes a slightly different discourse that doesn't change the necessity of these investability pacts and the fact that they're very much preserved and buttressed, if anything. But nonetheless, the rationale changes a little bit, and it's no longer in the name of letting finance do its thing, but in the name of encouraging finance to do the right thing. And that's when you get from an implicit Wall Street consensus, it seems to me, to an explicit Wall Street consensus.
Yes, that's a very clever way of putting it, I guess. The monetary de-risking that I described, where the central bank says, okay, I will preserve my independence, even if I know that my independence is fundamentally predicated on the idea that I stay out of government bond markets. This is how Milton Friedman imagined it. This is how Milton Friedman described it. This is how Milton Friedman pushed it. I now have to recognize that the modern financial system which we have designed has its cornerstone of stability and of credit creation or government bond markets, and therefore I have to intervene there for financial stability reasons to restore orderly market functioning. This is how, for example, how both Mario Draghi, who is, the European liberal elites used to call him Super Mario because against German will and against, there is a fascinating account in the Financial Times of Angela Merkel crying in a meeting with Barack Obama, and there are tears falling down her cheek, and you think, why is this woman who is viewed as the most effective politician in Europe, why is she crying? And she's crying because Barack Obama is trying to get her to allow the ECB to intervene in government bond markets. This probably is the only episode I'm aware of where a politician is crying about central bank interventions in government bond markets.
Which is very moving for you, right?
Well, it is moving in some ways because, if she had cried 2 years earlier, it would have been great. It took 2 years for this crying to take place. And I think it's moving also because we generally spend so little time. This is my biggest complaint in life, is that we don't spend enough time thinking about central banks, observing central banks, noticing them. In my progressive political circles, most people don't think that the central bank is an important political actor. And then when I tell the story that Angela Merkel cries in 2011 because Barack Obama says, either you let the ECB buy government bonds or the whole system crashes, and please let them. And she says, no, I can't do this. And Bundesbank doesn't want me. This is against my people, blah, 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 blah. There, you're right. There, it is a political instance where we see monetary de-risking is a form of reestablishing the market order of neoliberalism and of financialization. It is not done for transformative purposes. It's a defensive, let's call it a defensive de-risking. It simply is trying to defend financial capital from its worst kind of destructive tendencies, which is, you speculate on government bonds and then they crash, and then the entire edifice of your modern financial system collapses. You're right. And then by 2015, this defensive de-risking in the monetary sphere, which incidentally greatly increases the political power of central banks. The fiscal powers of central banks are much larger than they were during the Milton Friedman era in some ways, because now we are in a world, in the Wall Street consensus, where central banks have complete discretion whether they intervene or not. They have discretion over how much government bonds they buy or sell, at what points, for what reasons. that discretion to me is a very significant problem, and probably we'll come back to that. But so leaving that aside, this defensive de-risking of that central banks take with varying degrees of political questioning and political resistance. In the US, the Federal Reserve did this and nobody cared. In the United Kingdom, the Bank of England even adopted formally a market maker of last resort role in 2015, which said, I'm going to buy as many government bonds I like, whenever I like, and hold them for however long I like. Nobody batted an eye. It was the European Union, because of its particular institutional and political makeup, that created a lot more resistance to this defensive de-risking. But by 2015, we shift into a more, let's call it, transformative de-risking, as a mode in which de-risking becomes a way of remaking capitalism and overcoming, particularly in Europe, some of the problems and difficulties of a long period of austerity, because of course this defensive de-risking doesn't change the political commitment to fiscal austerity in the euro area or anywhere. It actually reinforces it, because it says it's very difficult for central banks to account for it as a, I mean, they sometimes do. When they talk to financial markets, they say we buy government bonds during periods of market stress because we are worried about financial stability and we want an orderly functioning of this market that is not just providing the sovereign with resources to conduct fiscal policy, but it's a market that provides market-based finance with the asset that allows the entire system to function. Right, so that's the story that they tell to private finance, but to other political actors, the story is usually, well, you know, these sovereigns don't have sound fiscal positions, and we have to think very carefully about fiscal dominance, and we don't really like intervening, and la la la. So to me, this defensive de-risking reinforces the political impulse and the political dominance, to some extent hegemony of fiscal austerity. Whereas the transformative de-risking of that picks up pace and becomes visible as a political project in 2015, that is about let's reimagine the world, let's transform the world, let's transform our economies, and that will require us to partner with private capital.
Okay, so now we're in the full self-conscious era of Wall Street consensus, and de-risking is a good thing. De-risking becomes even the proper way of doing good while doing well, right? Yeah. And you can see that it's even taken up by private finance. I mean, that's when Larry Fink and BlackRock comes to full prominence by saying that, you know, we're in the business of saving the world and transforming the world too, in partnership with government. But you also have, when then de-risking is in full bloom, you still have what could be called a variety of de-risking regime, just like, you know, we talked about variety of capitalism. So, for instance, de-risking in the European Union is not exactly the same as what de-risking will be with Bidenomics, which is not the same thing as what de-risking is imagined to produce in the Global South. So quickly on the variety of these de-risking regimes.
Of course, yes, you're right that the modes and practices of de-risking, which is a kind of umbrella term for relationships between the state and capital, and financial capital in particular. These modes vary according to national or whatever regional characteristics, and they also vary to some extent. They also change, I would say, historically, as the kind of grip of the neoliberal logic weakens over time, right? And you could say, well, has the grip of neoliberal logic weakened over time? For somebody like me who's an economist, I would say yes, because de-risking first emerges as a project to finance and produce infrastructure international development in 2015. It in parallel emerges as a project to finance the climate transition in the European Union in 2015. And then it moves towards industrial policy once the Biden administration basically says neoliberalism is in the past. We have to do industrial policy, both because it's a way to restore the American middle class dreams, and it's a way for us to fight China. So you're right that de-risking changes historically both with specific country political processes, but it also changes globally as its reach changes as the neoliberal grip on politicians and the political imaginary weakens over time. And the way that I would describe some of the differences in those kinds of practices of de-risking is that it certainly starts in international development as a project for countries in the global south. And BlackRock is not there yet. In 2015, if you look, for example, the one interesting way or fascinating way to kind of trace the actors in de-risking is to look at the IMF World Bank spring and annual meetings, where you will have, it's a kind of ritual where besides engaging civil society organizations or ministers of finance and governors of central banks meeting, the World Bank produces a series of panels through which it pushes its specific ideological project and its specific direction for travel through these panels. And in 2015, when I would say marks the official beginning of the transformative de-risking and the Wall Street Consensus, in 2015, you have a panel on infrastructure, investment, on how to make infrastructure investable. And the representative of financial capital is not actually somebody from Wall Street. It's a French asset manager, a private equity firm called Meridiam. And his boss, the boss of this company called Thierry Dault, who is very close to Macron, and we will kind of pop up in various Macron administrations in various photos after that. He's on the stage with a minister of infrastructure, I think, or minister of finance from Peru, because the meeting takes place in Peru, and with somebody from the World Bank, with a moderator from the Financial Times, and with another minister from, I think, Côte d'Ivoire, a minister of finance from Côte d'Ivoire.
What year is that?
2015. Mm-hmm. And so this is a panel. It's like an hour and a half panel, and the question is, how do we make infrastructure investable? And it's a fascinating panel because the answer that Thierry Dault provides, that this financier provides, is to say, well, the government has to take some risks. I'm happy to invest in infrastructure. I'm happy to go to Côte d'Ivoire, or I'm happy to go to Peru and build hospitals and manage hospitals on behalf of or for the government or on behalf of citizens, but the government has to take some risks. And the Financial Times moderator responds, well, aren't you proposing a public-private partnership like the ones that we have in the UK that were so bad for the public purse that we stopped doing them? Aren't there any risks? And the answer from both ministers and from the financier, from Thierry Dault, is, of course, the distributions of risk between the private sector and the state in this investability or in making infrastructure bankable. The distributions of risks can be exposed to a certain, let's say, excess, as in it gives excessive benefits to the private sector, excessive costs to the public sector. But this is a question of transparency. This is not a problem. Nobody says with the idea of investable infrastructure, we are privatizing every kind of public good. And that's where the neoliberal logic continues. The transformative de-risking project in infrastructure is a project of privatizing social and other kinds of infrastructure. But nobody talks about this because for politicians, the question is, I can't build a hospital, or the problem is I can't build a hospital. Thierry Dault and Meridiam will build this hospital for me. They have the money, they have the trillions, we can put it in there as long as I take some risks. And I'm writing this book on the Wall Street Consensus, and in the chapter where I trace the rise of the Wall Street Consensus in international development, I look at the ways in which Thierry Doe and Meridiam basically kind of took over the construction of public-private hospitals in Turkey. And this was one of the most expensive, for the Turkish state, it was one of the most expensive ways of building private hospitals or allowing private finance to run hospitals for you. It ended up costing around 40% of GDP in fiscal costs. It was such a big cost. And it had many implications for Erdogan, including, the kind of social mobilization that he had to accommodate, and that pushed him to withdraw a bit from the neoliberal / Wall Street Consensus agenda that he had earlier. And now Turkey doesn't do PPPs in hospitals anymore because of the excessive cost that Thierry Doe and Meridiam kind of managed to, or excessive profits that they managed to extract. So
which means that they now invest public money in hospital, or just they don't do hospital at all?
No, now it's a public money. They are back to public investment, because that's the fundamental. I mean, to be clear, what the Wall Street Consensus says is there is not enough public money. It doesn't diagnose the absence of public money as a problem of the distributional politics of neoliberalism, where you don't tax corporations properly, where you let where you let high net worth individuals or the very rich to move money around in a way that basically arbitrages any significant tax regime that you want to impose of them, where you privatize your pay-as-you-go pensions and create these large pools of capital that then you give to financiers to build your infrastructure. The Wall Street Consensus never considers this. It takes as a starting point that there are limited fiscal resources, you can't get more of them. What you can do is redirect some of them towards de-risking, right? So, yes, I would say the alternative of public investment is always, although the state is supposed to be back, it's always viewed as either unfeasible on its terms or really undesirable because, the public sector, neoliberalism tells us, cannot run things properly.
So now that we've established what de-risking is, first in its implicit form and then in its deliberate form, the question is, what does the critique of de-risking entail? Is it about exposing the fact that private-public partnerships are a scam and just an excuse for privatization, and so therefore we should sort of attack the very logic of de-risking? Or, considering where we are in the circumstances, we should think of a critique of de-risking as saying, well, if you want de-risking, in other words, if you want to mobilize private finance to do good while they do relatively well still, maybe you need to add what you call sticks to the carrots that exist now.
Okay, so I would say there have been two sorts of responses to my work. One is to say that the critique of de-risking that I am developing is a kind of almost a sort of vulgar Marxist account of the state subordinated to the will and the profit imperative of private finance in this case. And the second critique is, well, not all de-risking is bad, and we could design de-risking in a way that both recognizes the political limitations of transformative state projects. Not everybody can conjure up out of nowhere some kind of a new political system in which spending large amounts of public money is possible. Instead, we should think about de-risking with guardrails, right? And let me take you very quickly through these two critiques, because I think both are in some ways, the first one is a bit unfair, and the second one is probably imagining de-risking with conditions or with discipline that I'm not sure is possible. So the first one on is de-risking or a critique of de-risking simply a kind of new new take on the old Marxist view that the state is basically eventually, immediately, ultimately subordinated to the interests of financial capital, that somehow the ruling class, as Fred Bloch used to put it, the ruling class does have class consciousness, it knows what it wants, and it just gets there, and it gets the state, it enrolls the state in achieving that. And I would say that the de-risking is not a totalizing project in which once the state announces that it will do de-risking and it will create partnerships with private capital, those partnerships unfold quickly, smoothly, seamlessly, and they just lead to the total privatization of social and economic life. And let me give you the example of the European Union, because I think that's a very instructive example of how de-risking can very quickly become something else, a different kind of animal, that can lead us into a very different state-capital relation. So when the European Union in 2015, under the new Jean-Claude Juncker Commission, says we can't do austerity anymore, this is fraying the social fabric in the Union, it's creating too much political tension, what we will do instead, there is a kind of move towards green capitalism of some sort. They say, okay, we need more public investment, we need more private investment, we will put these two together, public and private, in a kind of de-risking logic, and this will get us out of this austerity-driven contraction or stagnation that we find ourselves in. And as the observers and analysts point out that the kind of de-risking magic that was involved in the Juncker Commission's calculations, that they were supposed to mobilize, I don't know, to the order of 10 to 20 euros for in private capital for each euro in public money put in the project, as they call it, voodoo or magic or whatever else, the Juncker Commission responds, well, you know what? Instead of simply creating a kind of vehicle or an institution that would do de-risking and will mobilize private capital, what we will do to advance our project of green capitalism is to introduce the sustainable finance taxonomy. And the sustainable finance taxonomy is a way in which it starts within a logic of de-risking to say, how can we identify green projects where finance could invest, and how could we encourage investment in those green projects, and therefore, accelerate our climate transition, deal with a climate challenge. They didn't call it a climate crisis then. And the sustainable finance taxonomy that starts as a de-risking project, it very quickly mutates into the European states together collectively, kind of trying to create a project to discipline finance into green priorities rather than to bribe it, because de-risking is a bribing project. It says, I need to identify how much subsidies or regulatory or fiscal I need to give this project or this sector or this financier in order for them to invest. But in the sustainable finance taxonomy and then in the Green New Deal project of the European Commission, what we see is that de-risking mutates into a state discipline project as the high-level expert group that the European Commission puts together, which was mostly but not exclusively made of financiers, says, well, we should have a green supporting factor, which is a technical term for de-risking particular sets of assets or of green assets. Besides this green supporting factor, we should have a brown penalizing factor. And this is where you see one of the most important political struggles between the state and private finance unfolding in the age of the new Wall Street consensus. It's a struggle that features not just BlackRock, although BlackRock is kind of, because it's by then is the largest global asset manager, is the largest financial institution in the world. We're all keeping track of what BlackRock does, so it's much more visible. But BlackRock, European banking lobby, the European capital markets lobby, everybody is lobbying very hard, because all of a sudden the European states are saying, we should discipline private capital into our climate priorities. We should create a framework in which, if they choose to lend to dirty activities, we will penalize them. We will make it more expensive. We will bring sticks alongside carrots, right? And this project lasts for, I would say, in some weaker form or increasingly weakened form until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which completely flips in many ways the political priorities of both the European Commission and the political power and the lobbying power of a private finance. But we had, let's say, 4 or 5 years in which de-risking threatened to become a strong state project that disciplined capital, and that said one way to get the trillions of institutional investors, like the pension funds from the US or the pension funds from the Netherlands or from Denmark, one way to get them into climate investment is to give them bribes, is to de-risk. The other way is to basically punish them if they invest in dirty activities, and that's, you get automatic reallocations because it's much more expensive to go there. And then the European Central Bank does the same, and sometimes I joke that the European Central Bank is probably the most, it's an embryonic but the most visible example of a green central planner that we've had since 2008, because the European Central Bank said, I don't need the taxonomy, I don't need to think about the brown penalizing factor, I'm going to do my own thing. And my own thing would be, well, it looks like I'm going to penalize the issuers of dirty corporate bonds, that are financing dirty activities, and I'm going to design a framework for doing so. And it did it for 9 months between 2022 and 2023. So we have all this, realignments or escapes or redirections of de-risking projects into something more state-driven. It's not necessarily that the state always starts with de-risking and ends with de-risking. There are possible political other political trajectories possible. As to can we do sticks and carrots at the same time? To me, de-risking is fundamentally inconsistent with sticks and carrots framework, in the sense that the premise of partnership between the state and private capital is a premise of I take risks, you invest, but I put you in the driving seat. This is how I think about de-risking: is you put private capital in the driving seat. You establish the direction of travel, as in you're saying, okay, I'm going to de-risk for these sectors or for these activities or for these infrastructure asset classes or for these industries in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the direction of travel, but you're in the driving seat. You put let's not use fossil fuels. You put the electricity in it. You decide the speed at which you go. I will just subsidize some bits of it, but private capital is in the driving seat. And the moment we start to think about carrots and sticks, we have to think about the state in the driving seat. And when the state is in the driving seat, to me, it's not just it offers carrots at the beginning of a project in order to change risk-adjusted returns for the private investor, but the sticks framework is fundamentally different, because it requires the state to constantly monitor the performance of the investors that it supports against some strategic priorities. So I would say it's inconsistent. De-risking is not a political project that can easily accommodate the kinds of sticks that are necessary for transformative state projects. And that's why, to me, the Biden administration, although it triggered some increase in manufacturing investment in the United States, it was never going to be a viable counter project to the Chinese state-led industrial policy. The Biden administration still had a private capital-led de-risking project in industrial policy. Having said that, I also sometimes, as a policy advisor, wear a hat of pragmatism, and there is a hat of pragmatism for countries in the global south that says there should be certain sectors where you could do let's call it some kind of developmental de-risking. For example, in the energy sector or in energy investment, I would say mostly I would kind of bracket or isolate social goods like education, health. Those social infrastructures should always be publicly funded, publicly owned, publicly invested. But there are certain sectors like energy where you could think about, or like climate investments where you could think about creating some kinds of conditionalities and some kinds of small sticks for investors, because you have technological and financial dependencies that you cannot simply overturn in the life of one political cycle, and then you can say, okay, I will try to mobilize private finance, but it's going to be it's going to be an attempt to be a more equal relationship, where not only where we are distributing profits fairly, where it's not just that I'm assuming the risks and you get the return. So there could be some there could be some areas of de-risking where a combination of sticks and carrots might work. Besides the energy sector, the energy investments, particularly renewable energies, is probably one where I would reluctantly agree that given the constraints that countries in the global south have, we could do that. With my colleague Ndongo Sambasila from Senegal, we worked on Namibia's attempts to create a green hydrogen sector through de-risking, that is through taking some of the risks from private equity and investors and German renewable green hydrogen experts. And what we argue there is, okay, if you do the risking for this green hydrogen sector, if it gives you significant foreign exchange resources, but they have to be paired with a very clear, elaborate industrial strategy in which you create forwards and backwards linkages with the green hydrogen, with the risk green hydrogen, and you use some of the revenues from there in order to support your local economy, in order to do industrial upgrading. So it could be used in conjunction or together with industrial policy strategies, but never just as the vehicle for industrial policy.
I mean, we won't get into it now, but the problem, there's an extra problem with the Namibia project, which we touched on when we interviewed Eyal Weizmann, is that the government of Namibia, in going on with this project, is also using it in part to sort of cover up and negate the Nama and Ovaherero genocide of the early 20th century. So that's an extra problem. We won't get there. But okay, so one of the main argument for deliberate de-risking, once again, so the second phase, and the one that led even to what you saw as a modicum of step in the right direction with what the European Union was doing somewhere between 2017 and 2022. That was the positive argument for a certain form of de-risking, maybe even for the possibility of a reform of de-risking where sticks would be added to carrots. Okay, so the question now is now. And I won't say, I mean, I could say that, you know, de-risking was terrible, as you showed, but we'll miss it when it's gone. But maybe we are at a juncture like that because some hegemons are starting to whine again, and we don't have a de-risking for a green future rhetoric anymore. We have a drill, baby drill rhetoric that is going on. So what does that mean for the future of de-risking and the future of the Wall Street consensus? Could it be that Trump to zero, but also Trump to zero in its growing entente with Putin's Russia and their entente for fossil fuel partnership, could that in a way threaten the Wall Street consensus, the de-risking approach, to the extent that its positive argument was about what could be called greenwashing or a greening of the world altogether. So that's a question there, especially when surrounding Trump, you have libertarians, and when you think libertarians, you think more tax cut than tax credit. So some kind of a return on steroid to the Washington consensus instead of the other, instead of the Wall Street consensus. However, you've shown recently that de-risking is not dead, even under Trump, and that another kind, dirtier, browner kind of de-risking is possible and is in fact happening. And you took the example of USAID and divestment in USAID, and you showed that it was more complicated than just a form of divestment. So if you can just go back to that as an example of the new era possible of de-risking under Trump.
Very good. So let's put it this way. The election of Donald Trump in November 2024 seemed at first to kind of announce a break, I would say, at least in the BlackRock kind of Wall Street consensus that the Biden administration embodied so well. If you think about what the role of BlackRock in the Wall Street consensus, I mean, I use it as an example regularly because, not just because it's a large global asset manager, not just because it often deploys its infrastructural power to fight back against more transformative state projects that threaten the premise of this kind of de-risking investibility partnership. And the European Union is a good example of where it fought back very viciously and very systematically against the attempts of the European Union to create a framework for disciplining brown capital or carbon capital, in which I include BlackRock, despite its many attempts of greenwashing. And the Biden administration seemed to me, once it was elected and once its initial Rooseveltian impulse, because, at the beginning, Biden thought of himself a Roosevelt. He denounced the inequalities of capitalism. He denounced the unfairness. He promised to do redistribution. He promised to go against big capital. And for a while, I thought, well, maybe this means that the structural and political power of BlackRock would be rolled out. But when you look at the design of the Inflation Reduction Act, you will see that one of its main architects came from BlackRock, Brian Deese. He was previously with Obama administration as a climate policymaker. And the intuition of the Inflation Reduction Act is very much the intuition of de-risking. It says you get tax credits if you invest in these priority areas that have to do with clean technologies or they have to do with clean energy infrastructure. These tax credits are a sublime form of carrots, if you want, because they stack. And this has to do a lot, not necessarily with the specific preferences of the Biden policy lead, but with the political constraints of trying to push an industrial policy package through an American political system in which the Republicans are constantly, and some Democrats are going to constantly obstruct that process. So the political compromise is a stacking of carrots that includes, rewards if your new clean tech plant or your new solar plant has some worker-friendly provisions, if it meets certain local sourcing requirements. So it's, in a sense, it's progressive aspirations repackaged as carrots for not just BlackRock, but other kinds of private financial institutions. And we often think, and I heard this when I was living in the United States a couple of years ago. I often heard this idea that BlackRock, with its kind of industrial policy impulse, with its sectoral approach, with its Larry Fink who writes letters to investors announcing a better kind of capitalism, or announcing in 2021 he famously announced that that climate was now the horizon for economic policy making for a very long time, and BlackRock had to and private finance had to play a role in it, and they were going to become they were willingly going to readjust their investments in order to support governments. I think it was a Trojan horse for fighting back against more muscular forms of climate policy. But BlackRock was always viewed as the friendly face of financial capital, the Democrat face of financial capital, whereas Blackstone and private equity firms like Apollo or KKR are typically viewed as the Republican face, right? So when, but if actually, as an aside, if you look at the largest private beneficiaries of some of the US Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, Blackstone is one of them. Blackstone owns a lot of renewable energy infrastructure and new renewable energy companies with redirecting public pension fund money from the United States. But it's that distinction, BlackRock Democrat, Blackstone Republican, collapses when you look a bit at the ways in which the Biden administration's form of de-risking spread the benefits around various what we would think as factions of financial capital. So to go back to your question, when the Biden lost the election, and Donald Trump announced a kind of came with this wounded hegemon or whiny hegemon posture, which I think the Biden administration also had to some extent. It wasn't so explicit. They were not denouncing their allies. They were not denouncing Canada. They were not denouncing the European Union. But the Inflation Reduction Act was explicitly as a plan to try to attract investment from the European Union into the United States. It was a plan that Europeans felt as a great betrayal of the alliance. So the continuities are there. But I still thought, okay, maybe the age of the Wall Street consensus is at its dawn, because this soft, in some ways, de-risking is a soft power approach. It says we can achieve things if we partner with private capital. We can have priorities that are that the market likes, but also they can be framed in a progressive way. And the great power politics discourse is not there. It is not explicitly there. But since then, I'm starting to think that actually we can think of the Trump administration as a form or a mutation of the Wall Street consensus. So it's not the end, it's a mutation. And before I go to talk about the two pillars, which I think are important to identify in the economic and macro-financial logic of the second Trump administration, let me just give you an account of how the US aid trajectory convinced me that maybe we are just seeing a kind of, neo-colonial de-risking at play in the Trump administration. So the story of US aid, if you talk to a broad section of on the political spectrum, the story of the Dodge dismantling the US aid is this was an institution of American soft power that did a lot of good. It helped countries, in poor countries in the global south. It helped poor people of poor countries in the global south in a way that not many other countries did. And losing that funding will basically mean a terrible loss, not just for soft American power, but also for the people who are benefiting there. And what I do in that piece that you described in Phenomenal World is to say, well, if we look more carefully at what USAID was doing before January 2025, the USAID, like many official aid institutions of countries in the global north, was an instrument of de-risking besides doing, gender work and besides doing humanitarian work. It did work as an arm of de-risking for the United States. You can see it in the Power Africa projects that it supported, which and I provide in there several examples of countries ranging from Kenya to Ghana to Uganda, where US aid helped BlackRock or other private financiers basically enter de-risking partnerships with governments that were structured to greatly benefit BlackRock at the significant extent of local taxpayers and the expense of local industries. And there is a story about the a Kenyan wind power project called Lake Turkana wind project. And you can the terms of de-risking were so favorable to the original investors. BlackRock wasn't there from the beginning, but it became the one of the largest shareholders. The terms of de-risking were so unfavorable for the Kenyan state, who agreed and entered a purchasing power agreement that says, I'm going to buy at this price for this amount of years, and plus I'm going to support plus international institutions, including the USAID, provided some other kinds of de-risking for the loans given to the project managers. The terms were so unfair that there is now an anti-corruption investigation triggered by the Kenyan parliament to look into who got bribed in the government to agree to this. Even the World Bank thought that the terms were too onerous for the Kenyan government. Even local Kenyan industries were complaining, saying that somehow, although Kenya has the largest wind plant on the African continent, it has also one of the highest energy costs, and this is obstructing the industrialization process. So you could see here how de-risking in the energy sector can basically undermine a project of industrialization, which is kind of flips the whole logic of what we described for Namibia's green hydrogen project as a potential alignment between a de-risking strategy and an industrial policy strategy. So the USAID is not a simple story of the benevolent hegemon sort of going to countries in the global south and supporting certain parts of the most disadvantaged population one way or another. It's also a story about an official arm of the United States advancing particular interests of financial capital in critical infrastructure in the global south. And what the Trump administration and the Trump supporters that are thinking about or targeting USAID, and I referred in there to a blog by two financiers called How to Dodge USAID. What they're saying is, let's keep the de-risking part and kick out the woke capitalism part. We kick out climate, we kick out gender, we kick out all the work that USAID was doing in the kind of old paradigm of international development, in the liberal paradigm. We kick that all out, and we keep the de-risking intuition, which is we use the USAID in order to create profit opportunities and access to critical infrastructure and critical minerals for the United States and for American capital. It's very, very explicit. They even include Greenland as an example of how a revamped USAID moved into another institution could be used in order to co-invest in Greenland for the benefit of American capital. So I would say that example tells us that there is some kind of continuity, at least in some of the institutions of the Wall Street Consensus, some of the domestic U.S. institutions of the Wall Street Consensus. But then USAID is just one small example, I would say, of a broader transformation, but not disappearance, of the Wall Street Consensus under the Trump administration. And the way that I think about it, and the way that I think about the Wall Street Consensus in general, is the Wall Street Consensus in its more, let's say, ambitious, constructive, deliberate form rather than the defensive form. It emerges in response to transformative state projects, right? When you say in 2015, when we had the the beginning of transformative ambitions in international development, then in climate, then in industrial policy. There are transformative state projects that big finance occupies because the neoliberal restrictions around public investment are too difficult to overcome. And if you think about this relationship between de-risking and transformation as a political ambition, then you could say that the Trump administration has in its economic policies and its logic of reorganizing both the domestic and international economic order, it has two pillars. One pillar is transformative tariffs. They want to do with tariffs what the Biden administration wanted to do with tax credits. That is to say, and this is kind of going into the weeds of de-risking as a technique of government to change price signals into a different direction, right? It doesn't repress price signals. It just says, I want to make sure that the price signal is strong enough for capital to go into this area. That's what tax credits do. They improve risk-adjusted returns in certain sectors. The de-risking intervention is a kind of ordoliberal logic of changing price signals. And tariffs do the same, but in a much blunter form. The logic of transformative tariffs is to assume that somehow if you increase tariffs high enough, you would be able to trigger reallocations of capital across sectors in a way that benefits American manufacturing. This is the fundamental intuition of transformative tariffs. So to me, the Trump administration has a transformative project, but in parallel, it also has what Melinda Cooper calls an antisocial state project. And this antisocial state project is pure Wall Street consensus to me. It comes on the back of decades of the state surrendering bigger and bigger parts of its social contract with citizens to private finance. It started with pensions, then it went into housing, it went into health, it went into education. This is what the Wall Street consensus is in a kind of its social manifestation. It surrenders parts of the social contract to private finance because the state, for a variety of reasons, thinks ideological or fiscal pragmatic, thinks it cannot not deliver them anymore. And if you look at the dominance of private equity firms within and funds and private equity titans within the Trump administration, I would say that there you can see how this antisocial state, that project is a project of surrendering, particularly privatizing social security and creating what Larry Fink calls in his most recent letter in I think it was late February or early March, he called it the democratization of investment, which is a kind of roundabout way of asking for the savings of regular Americans in 401ks, in this kind of savings retirement plans, to be put into private equity firms, which then these private equity firms will direct into infrastructure. If you listen to any private equity titan today, maybe not today, but last week before the transformative Trump tariffs came in and kind of changed the outlook a bit. But private equity titans, they all say the Trump administration understands the importance of infrastructure. Infrastructure is a long-term asset class that will deliver excellent returns, and we are committed to helping the Trump administration and other governments, I don't know, the Keir Starmer Labour government and the German government. We are committed to working with these governments in order to co-invest in infrastructure. So to me, the Wall Street consensus in the Trump administration is transforming through this tension between, or it's mutating through this tension between transformative tariffs, which the Trump administration wants to use in order to meet its political commitments or promises to its MAGA base, and then the anti-social state project of private equity, which is to continue to enlist the state in the further privatization of the social contract. And until yesterday, I thought, okay, or until the Wednesday in which the Trump administration said maybe transformative tariffs are a bit too hard to push through, I thought perhaps the Trump administration is going to push against the interests of Wall Street and push through transformative tariffs that might be a blunt instrument, but they are an instrument of transformation in some ways. They will have to assume very significant social and economic cost, but something they will transform in the way that the Volcker shock and the Reagan years transformed the American economy and created conditions for financialized accumulation. Now, after that Wednesday, in which Trump said, I'm going to pause this, I am more, and seeing that Scott Bessent, the US Treasury Secretary, is gaining power within the US administration, I'm starting to believe that the Wall Street consensus beat of the Trump 2.0 project is getting stronger. It's getting stronger, and it will probably become entrenched with one caveat. It is possible at some point that either because the existing tariffs on China, which can maybe still be called transformative in some ways because China is such an important trading partner directly and indirectly, it is possible that it will continue to create stock market and bond market tensions and exit from US dollar assets that will push the Trump administration into the direction which my critique of de-risking suggests we have to go into in order to move away from this kind of post-neoliberal logic of de-risking. We need to reconsider the relationship between the Treasury or the Ministries of Finance, between government in general, elected government, and central banks. And if Donald Trump goes into that direction, if he says, you know what, I want the Fed to do things for me, and this independence can't continue because I can't transform the international order, I can't transform the national order with an independent Federal Reserve. Every large transformative state project that was successful required a different institutional configuration. If this happens, then I would say the Wall Street consensus is dead. I would say that probably is the best way to read the death of the Wall Street consensus is when central banks lose independence and become an arm of the state deployed for transformative purposes, whether authoritarian or other kinds of purposes. But until that happens, I would say the project has to stay alive because, or the logic of the Wall Street consensus will remain hegemonic because any kind of government that wants transformation will still have to run into the question of how do we pay for it.
Right. But so we're in a moment of doubt as far as this is concerned, where it's going to go. You're in doubt, but you're not the only one who's in doubt. So are the European governments on the one hand and governments of the global south on the other hand. So at least for as long as this uncertainty goes, what is the near future, or what could be the near future of the Wall Street consensus in Europe on the one hand, in the global south to the extent that we can generalize on the other hand?
I would say in my most pessimistic reading is that the Wall Street consensus will thrive because it thrives on crisis conditions in which governments are faced with shrinking fiscal resources for addressing the crisis one way or another, and because the crisis conditions require some kind of response, then the response is private finance. So as long as these crisis conditions, for example, increasing investment in welfare, if you look at in warfare, if you look at the European Union, the way in which it frames the current geopolitical moment and challenge is welfare for warfare, as in we will have to reduce our welfare spending, increase our warfare spending, increase our military budgets. That's the only way forward. And part of the increase in military budgets is going to come through the magic of de-risking, that is to mobilize private capital into warfare. I think that's a kind of more complicated political proposition, but the logic, the political instinct is still this one. It's not to say, well, the ECB should be buying more government bonds, or we need a different kind of institutional arrangement. The logic is still we need to work within the constraints of the neoliberal institutional framework. So that always gives the answer private finance. So I'm not entirely optimistic even if I look at the Labour government in the United Kingdom that got a large majority that would allow it to do more transformative politics if it chose to, it still thinks that it will get BlackRock to rebuild Britain. It thought that before Trump was elected. I think it continues to think that. So I can't see that that's the way in which critical macrofinance sets up the conditions for existence of the Wall Street consensus, is that for the near term, the alternative has to come from changing the institutional architecture of the state in terms of macroeconomic policy making. And until that changes, and that's why I said that maybe Trump will be able to break that, and whether that's a politically desirable issue is a separate question. But on the simple, on the logic of institutional transformation, we are not there yet. We are not there, and I think every moment of transformative intentions, like the Liz Truss government had also transformative intentions. Donald Trump's transformative tariffs, they have been read as validations of you can't work against private finance. You have to work with it, and to work with it, you have to go back to the logic of the Wall Street consensus.
At the same time, I mean, pushing you a little bit on this, at the same time, the uncertainty created by the Trump administration, even in the wake of suspending the tariffs for 90 days, is such that it, for the great pleasure, anticipatory pleasure of China, among others, there is a tendency in Europe, and even more in the South, of saying, well, maybe we should try to dissociate as much as we can from America, which means not only the American government, but which means the entire web of private finance that is attached to America. So that, how does that could affect their allegiance to the Wall Street consensus?
Okay, I have to confess that I have not seen any government wanting, kind of thinking that, or publicly stating that let's call it. Remember that European governments used to also use de-risking for describing a new relationship with China after 2020-2021. In which there will be less kind of vulnerability to China by basically delinking a bit. So there is a logic of delinking that is part of great power politics, I would say. But I have not seen that governments in Europe applying that logic of delinking to American finance. They apply it to industrial goods. They apply to energy. Well, at least there seems to be an attempt to think about energy sovereignty, not just in the context of the climate transition. But I would say particularly for Europe, the situation or the politics is complicated because for a while now, Europe has bought into the American narrative that China's successful gaming of the U.S. international economic order, because this is how I would describe what has happened over the whiny hegemon. The hegemon is whining in some ways because China has proven very adept at gaming the system that the U.S. set up for it to benefit its own corporations internationally. And they didn't expect China to be able to do that. China succeeded, and now they want, I think, all the transformative tariffs they want to do internationally is to achieve what the Biden administration failed to do, which is to roll back China's threat to American hegemony. Now, is that going to entail at some point a more decisive break with American financing? At the moment, it seems to me quite the opposite, that the US is trying to let's say, renationalize American finance, because J.D. Vance and some parts of the Republican base and the Republican elite have, and you could hear Scott Bessent saying that every now and then, they have bought into, or they believe, at least publicly, a story of the US dollar as the reserve currency has not given, as we generally tend to think, has not given an exorbitant privilege to the United States as an issuer, but it has come with significant costs. And they sometimes use words like financialization, which is very bizarre, because this we used to think it's a leftist term that for denouncing the power of big finance, but they use the words financialization. And every now and then they would say stuff like capital controls, which is a form of renationalizing some bits of American finance under the idea that transformative tariffs cannot work and domestic manufacturing cannot basically re-emerge or blossom without some way of both preventing surplus countries from accumulating US dollar assets, but also preventing American finance from moving freely in and out and appreciating the US dollar, or creating patterns of a strong currency that go against the reindustrialization project. So that is a more interesting tension that I think, I mean, my view is that the power politics of the Trump project will never go as far as imposing capital controls, but I may be wrong. I may be wrong, and and I may underestimate the historical contingencies and the historical moment we are in which maybe significant dislocations are possible. I haven't seen that many dislocations yet that are very significant, but you are expecting more significant dislocations than I am.
No, it's not so much that I mean, I certainly have no inside information about it, but it seems that even if the J.D. Vance fantasies don't come through in the immediate future, the very possibility that they could, which you yourself raise, might also cross the mind of other governments. And so therefore you don't want to be waiting for it to happen or not happen for sure before you take measures. So it's in that perspective, I mean, we discussed yesterday the new plan of Spain, for instance, which you saw as a very classical form of de-risking. However, part of it is about being kind of more friendly to Chinese investment. So that is a step. I'm not saying it's a step necessarily in the right direction. It's not like I'm a Chinese enthusiast, but in terms of the diversification or the way of sort of warding off the possibility of these capital control fantasies coming through, that can trigger motion. And when motions are triggered, then who knows where they stop and where they lead.
You're right. I would say if I mean, inviting or courting Chinese investment, even the Trump administration, I think, might be contemplating that, because the way that I understand, you could say the Trump administration is in its relationship with China is replaying the American anxieties about the Japanese threat to American hegemony from the 1980s and the 1990s in the car industry and bigger. And the way that they resolve that in some ways is to get Japanese cars to car companies to go and invest in the US, and Europe could have a version of that, as in to say, okay, maybe we have now fallen behind with our clean tech technologies, with our ability to produce the very technological end of like new industries. The way is to ask for what the new international economic order countries in the global south asked for 50 years ago, which is technology transfers, right? So you could say, well, European countries could say, let's kind of enter some more benign regional, or not regional, but US excluding coalition of the willing, in which we have a fairer distribution of capacity to produce and a fairer distribution of consumption, right? Because that's one of the things that everybody levels at China, is that it doesn't encourage sufficient domestic consumption because it prioritizes export-led growth. It is a possibility. It is a kind of a more benign scenario than the one that China hawks are pushing both in Europe and in the US, in which the European Union becomes increasingly incensed with the fact that if China cannot export to the US, it's going to flood with its overcapacity European markets even more. I think I don't particularly buy the argument about overcapacity, because in some ways it suggests that there is some kind of equilibrium capacity that is given by the market, and industrial policies or by themselves and in themselves wrong or market distorting. That is a possible scenario. The more intriguing scenario for the Wall Street consensus is it possible for European countries to try to win themselves off American finance one way or another, and the dominance of American finance in both what we call traditional asset management and the growing dominance of American private equity firms in housing in Spain, in data infrastructure in the United Kingdom, or in continental Europe. And there again, I go back to the logic of the Investibility Pact. This has been built over decades in order to resolve the divorce between monetary and fiscal policy, and the terms of that divorce are still here with us today. And I don't see how kicking out a large source of demand for your sovereign debt and for your corporate debt is within the political horizon of European elites.
Okay. Maybe not.
Maybe not yet. They tried a weaker version of this when they tried to discipline BlackRock into investing less in coal companies, and that project failed for a variety of reasons.
No,
but you know that the conditions change.
Yes,
historical conditions change.
It would depend on the emergence of political forces in Europe that would call for that, right?
Yes.
And this leads me to my last series of questions, which is the emergence of these political forces would be the ones that would sort of lead to the possible transition to what you call a big green state. So let's get to that to finish it, not to finish in just scary things. So if as you believe the only way to address both the climate crisis and ever-growing inequalities is to break with what remains of the neoliberal pronouncement that are still very much there in the Wall Street consensus about fiscal policies, about the welfare state, about monetary policies, and the connection between the two. Well, the question is how to envision that transition both practically and politically. So we go back to what we touched on a little while ago, is the way to go to denounce the very logic of de-risking, like public goods should not be treated as investable assets, right? Or should that logic of de-risking be appropriated? Like if you really want to mobilize private capital in order to decarbonize or even build infrastructure, then, well, use the proper sticks alongside the carrots. That would be like the first question. Where do you start in terms of, I would say, your political discourse in a way?
Yeah, so my work on the big green state comes from a gradual, and I would say to some extent painful, realization that de-risking as a regime of decarbonization was always bound to fail. It was bound to fail in the sense that to be transformative de-risking is very hard to achieve without stoking a kind of greater de-democratization and a greater threat to the political order that liberal capitalism has put in place. So it doesn't work in distributional terms because of the privatization of public goods that comes with a discourse of investability. It doesn't work on its own terms because surrendering the pace of decarbonization to private capital is a bet. It's a risky bet that can't deliver at the scale and on the scale and at the pace that is necessary. It's also a risky geopolitical bet because I would say one way to think about the macro-financial aspects of the great power competition that we are seeing between at least China and the United States is a de-risking regime that fails during the Biden administration against a kind of big green state regime in China. So thinking about the first two, the economic and distributional inefficiencies or fault lines of de-risking led me to start to think about a return to big government under a green umbrella. And and I've worked with Ben Brown on this, and I'm continuing to think about it because my first objection as an economist, but also as a child of central planning, is that a big green state sounds. Let's say that the social forces are aligned that somehow we get a big green state, and I'll come back to the question of is this ever going to happen, or are we kind of dreaming the impossible as Che Guevara instructed us to do every now and then. But even if we get there, even if the social forces are arranged, we manage to roll back the power of financial capital. There are political coalitions and political pressure on governments to embark on these projects. To me, a big green state is a necessary return to a form of planning and a much larger footprint of the state in the economy. So that's already a demand that is complex because it doesn't only require green planners who are competent and can do planning, but it also requires us to contemplate questions of democracy and questions of power dynamics within there. So this is an unfinished kind of project, and I continue to think about it. And we use in this work with Ben Brown, we use the example of China as a country or a political system that mostly or is closest, although very far away from what we would imagine is a democratic big green state. But it comes there. It takes some steps towards a relationship between state and private capital, where the state is in the driving seat and can dictate, can engineer large economic transformation that is consistent with decarbonization aims, because there are very many losers in decarbonization politics, not just your regular consumers, not just the middle class, but we are talking about the losers in factions of capital, particularly carbon capital, that are very resistant. And I'm bracketing here the case of fossil fuel producers and oil exporters, because that's a very different political economy, and there the Wall Street Consensus has either doesn't work in this, or doesn't work at all, or it's not commending the political imaginary, or it's there in a very different form. But in liberal democracies that don't rely on fossil fuels as their main kind of economic activity, inflicting losses on capital is necessary as a part of a decarbonization project. And either you inflict losses in a disorderly way, and with Isabel Weber we worked on this possibility as carbon shock therapy, and you could say Germany had a form of carbon shock therapy because it allowed high energy prices to generate to accelerate the industrialization of certain sectors of manufacturing sectors of the German economy. Or you can have an orderly decarbonization, and that orderly decarbonization requires planning. And the more I think about it, the more that planning becomes more extensive and becomes almost more and more centralized. So yes, I know. Central planning is I grew up under it. It has many possibilities and points of failure, but it's also now I think if we are serious about the climate crisis, and almost nobody is at the moment in the political elites, but if we were to take it very seriously, then centralized planning is necessary in order to radically shift resources across sectors and to radically prepare economies to adapt, not economies for and sectors and households for a future of more intense climate crisis. So that's, I didn't answer your very important question, is how do we get there? I started with the problems. I don't know. I think it's a hard question, because getting there would require commanding political energies of the political energies of 2018, 2019, when lots of young people were out in the street and they were trying to get governments with Greta Thunberg to get governments to engage in radical transformation. Commanding those political energies sounds almost impossible today, generating and commanding them. So maybe the alternative is war economies, in which, you know, the war economy gradually becomes a climate war economy, but it starts as a war economy in which the government basically says, okay, as in any war economy, I need capital to do these things for me in order for me to achieve particular objectives. I'm just hoping it doesn't include a proper war and loss of life, but that's how I think about it now. It's
but the thing with, just to continue on this, the thing with war economy can take different forms. I mean, the Putin war economy is not the same as the Roosevelt war economy, right? So if it's true that when you are in a still somewhat functioning liberal democracy, war economies sometimes can sort of produce more democracy, if only because for the sacrifice that you ask people, you have to give rights in exchange. So that was part of the deal, of the New Deal, basically. With all its limitation, but nonetheless, okay. So that's a possibility. But if you don't go through the war economy and you try to get to the big green state in a different way, then we go back to the problem that you mentioned, is how to keep it democratic, because there seem to be not only one but three problems. The problem of authoritarianism, that very often comes with planning. The problem of cronyism, which was endemic in a lot of developmental regimes. And then the problem of self-defeating incrementalism, which has been the story of social democracies. So you have to basically try to avoid these three pitfalls to have planning and democracy. Yes,
I would say that the ideal transition to me, if the politics would be, we could get the politics right, the ideal transition towards a big green state is one in which there is sufficient political will to nationalize pension funds, because these are the largest source of funding for big finance, and they ground and they feed the power of big finance in ways that I find quite paradoxical, because it's ultimately, this was supposed to be workers' capital that would help democratize, you know, we always try to democratize capitalism, we always end up with more concentrated forms of it. And in parallel to nationalizing pension funds, it would be important to roll back one important plank of the Wall Street consensus, which is the privatization of the social contract. So in a sense, restoring a sort of maybe not Keynesian ideal, but restoring a Beveridge idea of a social contract with citizens that includes the provision of public goods, would make a war economy more palatable if citizens recognize, or a war economy like setting more palatable if citizens recognize that there are benefits to them from that kind of a radical transformation, that it's not only, you know, attacking the pensioners by nationalizing pension funds, but it's restoring a set of public goods that were the basis for collectively organizing through economic life through the state in the first place. How do you deal with the problems of cronyism? How do you deal with the problems of inefficiency? Well, nobody says that a big green state is an ideal political form. I don't think that this exists, and all the problems that you described characterize very well any form of capitalism I can think of. How do we? It would require, and I have colleagues who work on what they call democratic planning, which is a more decentralized form that creates some sort of safeguards or guardrails against the fault lines or the problems that you describe. I'm still having trouble imagining how this democratic planning would work, because it seems to me that it would involve forms of deliberation that are susceptible to the same kind of power politics as other forms of world making and policy making. But we have to think through these problems as you know, problems that occur in the process of radical transformation. So I'm not saying they are insignificant. I'm just saying they are part of political life one way or another, and it's not impossible to think a way through them.
Great. Well, just to finish, first of all, it seems that we started with Minsky and we're coming back to Minsky at the very end, so that's a nice full circle. And then just one remark that has been haunting me for like several decades, which is this little enigmatic sentence of Michel Foucault, saying that the left may have a theory of the state and a theory of social movements, but has no theory of government. Mm-hmm. And I think we're still in that predicament to a certain extent.
Yes. Well, we're trying to get out of it.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Look at all the lovely people.